This dog did something her husband never managed to do in all their years together. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Watch till the end and don't forget to like and subscribe. The road stretched endlessly ahead of her, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the bare, skeletal trees that lined either side. A pale fog clung low to the ground, curling around the base of the pines and whispering against the edges of the road. Aline gripped the steering wheel harder, knuckles white, her eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights and too many tears. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the tires humming beneath her and the occasional groan of the old suspension. Her phone lay face down in the passenger seat, turned off. She couldn't bear to look at it any more. Not at the names of people she thought were friends, not at the message thread that shattered her marriage with a single photo. She had walked in on her husband with her best friend. The image was burned into her mind so vividly she could see it every time she closed her eyes. 15 years together, and it had all come down to that one moment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She packed a suitcase and left. Now she was headed to the only place she had left, the one untouched by betrayal and lies, her grandfather's old house in the countryside. It had stood empty for a year since he died. No one else in the family wanted it. Too far, too quiet, too full of ghosts. But to Aline, it was a sanctuary, or at least it could be, a place to disappear. She didn't care about the isolation. In fact, she welcomed it when she finally turned onto the gravel path that led to the property. Dusk was already falling. The sky burned orange and purple at the edges, but the woods ahead loomed darker than they should. The house stood at the end of the lane, its roof sagging slightly, the shutters crooked, the porch steps weathered and soft. Yet, as her headlights swept across the front door, she felt something tighten in her chest, a strange, aching comfort. She parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long moment, staring at the porch. Then, with a heavy breath, she got out. The air was sharp and cold, filled with the scent of pine and something older, deeper, like damp earth and dried leaves. She walked up the creaking steps and unlocked the door with the key that had never left her key ring. Inside, the house was as she remembered it. Dust floated in the air, catching the last of the sunlight like glitter. The old armchair by the fireplace still had her grandfather's blanket draped over the back. His books were still stacked on the coffee table, yellowed and soft at the corners. She didn't bother turning on the lights. She just stood there in the dim glow, breathing it all in. That night, she didn't unpack. She lit a fire, made tea, and curled up on the couch with the blanket pulled over her. The silence was immense. It filled her ears like cotton, pressed down on her lungs. No sirens, no neighbors, no one yelling her name, just the crackle of fire and the occasional moan of old wood. She fell asleep watching the flames. The following days blurred together. She spent them cleaning, fixing, wandering from room to room as if retracing her childhood footsteps. The house was still solid, if a bit weary. So was she. In the mornings, she sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, wrapped in her grandfather's old flannel jacket, staring out at the overgrown yard and trying to remember how it felt to trust someone. At night, she lay in bed listening to the wind shift through the trees, wondering if healing was even possible or just another lie people told each other. One afternoon, she ventured up to the attic, drawn by something she couldn't name. The air up there was thick with dust and the sweet, stale scent of time. She pulled down old boxes, flipping through faded photographs and yellowing letters. That's when she found it. A photograph of her grandfather standing beside a large German shepherd. The dog's ears were perked, tongue lolling out in a proud grin. Scrawled in ink beneath the photo were the words, "Me and Gray, Summer '94. Her chest tightened. Gray, she remembered him. The dog that followed her everywhere as a child, who guarded her like a shadow. Her grandfather used to say, "If anything ever happens to me, Gray will know. He'll find the one who needs him." But Gray had vanished the same day her grandfather passed. No one ever saw him again. Some said he ran into the woods and died alone. Others whispered strange things, that they'd seen him weeks later, lurking near the cemetery or sitting outside the old church. Aline had dismissed it as small-town gossip, grief speaking through stories. Now, holding the photo in her trembling hands, she wasn't so sure. That night, she dreamed of Gray. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at her with eyes like coals, smoke curling around his paws. He didn't move, didn't bark, he just waited. When she woke, her cheeks were wet. She didn't remember crying. The days turned colder. The first frost clung to the window panes in the mornings, and the wind cut sharper through her coat. Aline tried to keep busy. She chopped wood, fixed loose hinges, even cooked from scratch again. But nothing filled the hollow ache inside. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was the slow unraveling of everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and herself. One fog-drenched morning, she heard it, a soft scratching at the door, then again, louder. She froze, heart pounding. The house was deep in the woods, no delivery men, no neighbors nearby. She walked to the door slowly, unsure if she was dreaming. When she opened it, the breath left her lungs. There, on the porch, stood a dog. Not just any dog. A massive, filthy German shepherd, ribs jutting under matted fur, one ear torn, eyes dark and unreadable. He looked straight at her. She knew those eyes. "Gray," she whispered. The dog didn't move. He didn't need to. She stepped forward, hand trembling as she reached for him. He didn't flinch. Her fingers brushed his face, and he leaned into her palm, closing his eyes. A sob broke from her chest. She dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around the dog's neck. He stood there, unmoving, letting her cry into his fur. Later, she brought him inside, cleaned him up, fed him warm broth, made a bed by the fireplace. He didn't bark, he didn't whimper. He simply watched her with those deep, knowing eyes. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without waking. And in the morning, when she found him lying at the foot of her bed, breathing slow and steady, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt safe. The morning light filtered through the faded curtains in long, golden lines, catching the dust that hung in the air like remnants of a dream. Aline sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dog lying across the wooden floor. Gray was still asleep, his massive body rising and falling with each slow breath. His fur was cleaner now, but still patchy in places, and the old scar above his shoulder glinted faintly in the light. She couldn't take her eyes off him. He looked so much like the Gray she remembered from her childhood, and yet time had carved its years into his frame. He was older, slower, but something in him hadn't changed. That steady presence, that silent understanding. She hadn't seen him in years, but it was like he had been waiting for her all along. She moved quietly through the house, her bare feet soft on the wooden planks. She made coffee, cracked the window open to let in the crisp autumn air, and stood by the kitchen sink, watching the garden overgrown with weeds. Somewhere beneath that tangle of green were the neat rows her grandfather had once kept so meticulously. Gray hadn't stirred. He was resting, deeply. Healing, perhaps, just like her. Later that morning, she took out a basin, filled it with warm water, and carried it into the living room. Gray opened one eye as she knelt beside him, a towel slung over her shoulder. "Time to make you feel a little more like yourself," she whispered. She didn't expect him to understand, but somehow he did. He shifted slightly, allowing her to wash him. She worked gently, peeling away dried mud and leaves, revealing faded patches of fur and old, healed-over scars. As she scrubbed, she noticed a thin leather strap around his neck. It was frayed and weathered, barely holding together. Hanging from it was a rusted tag. She brought it closer, squinting at the etched letters beneath the grime. "Gray," it read. Just that. As if the universe needed to remind her again, this wasn't some stray. This was him. Her Gray. After cleaning him, she brushed his coat and laid fresh blankets by the fireplace. He rested his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded, content. Aline sat nearby with her coffee, the fire crackling between them. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was warm, shared, like two survivors letting the world pass by without needing to say a word. Days passed. Each morning began the same. Coffee, the rustle of wind outside, Gray's quiet presence trailing behind her as she moved through the house. She began to talk to him more, not just greetings or commands, but real conversations. She told him about her divorce, how it broke her in ways she hadn't expected. She told him how she had trusted someone with everything, only to be thrown away like she meant nothing. She didn't expect answers, but Gray listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes never leaving her. And sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, while rummaging through a drawer in her grandfather's study, Aline found an old leather-bound notebook. It was his journal. She opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. Most entries were about the land, weather, gardening, but one page caught her eye. It was dated 3 months before his death. "They say he's just a dog, but I know better. Gray knows things. He waits, watches. He never forgets. I've told him, if anything happens to me, find her. She'll need you more than anyone else ever will. You protect her. You love her, just like you did me." Aline's hands shook. She read the paragraph over and over, her throat tightening. Her grandfather had believed in Gray, not just as a pet, but as something more, a guardian, a guide. Later that night, unable to sleep, she stepped out onto the porch. The moon was high, casting silver light across the grass. Gray followed her, his steps slow but steady. He sat beside her, his body warm against her side. She looked out into the dark trees and whispered, "Did he send you to me?" Gray didn't move, but somehow she knew the answer. That evening became the beginning of a new ritual. Every night, after the fire burned low, they would sit on the porch in silence. Aline would talk, Gray would listen, and as the stars turned overhead, something in her heart began to shift. Still, not everyone in the village welcomed the idea of Gray's return. When Aline visited the market for supplies, a few of the older villagers gave her odd looks. One woman, stooped and thin as a twig, stopped her near the produce stand. "You've got him, haven't you?" she said without preamble. Aline blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman leaned closer, eyes clouded but sharp. "The dog, the one who used to follow your grandfather. You brought him back." Aline hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He found me." The woman's face darkened. "Careful, child. That dog's been seen in these woods long after your grandfather died. Some say he's cursed, others say he's blessed, but no one ever sees him without something happening." Aline frowned. Like what? The woman shook her head. Storms, fires, accidents, and now you're here, and he's with you. Just be careful. The words haunted her. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the trees, Aline stared at the fire, her mind racing. Gray slept soundly by the hearth, unbothered. She wanted to believe he was just a dog, a loyal, incredible dog, but the weight of everything was pressing down again. She returned to her grandfather's journal, flipping through it for answers. In the final pages, one line was underlined twice. He is more than what he seems. She closed the book slowly. Her fingers trembled as she set it down. She looked at Gray, at his peaceful form. His ears twitched slightly as if he knew he was being watched. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the house shifted subtly. Aline began to feel like she was being watched when she went outside. Not by Gray, by something else. Once, walking to the edge of the garden, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned sharply. Nothing. Another time, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the back door creaking open. Gray was already at attention, growling low in his throat, but when she rushed out, nothing was there. She couldn't explain it, but something was coming. The village whispers, her grandfather's journal, the returning memories, they all led to one truth she could no longer ignore. Gray hadn't just found her, he had returned for a reason, and whatever it was, it hadn't fully revealed itself yet. But it would. Soon. The morning was unusually quiet, no birdsong, no wind rustling through the tall pines that surrounded the old house like silent sentinels. Aline stirred from a restless sleep, the weight of a strange dream still clinging to her limbs. She couldn't recall its details, only the overwhelming sense of urgency, of something just beyond reach. She turned her head toward the fireplace where Gray usually slept, but the hearth was empty. Panic flickered in her chest until she heard the soft thump of paws near the back door. Gray was there, staring outside, his ears alert, body stiff. Something in the air had shifted. Aline wrapped a sweater around herself and joined him, her bare feet cold against the floor. She opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Outside, the sky was washed in gray, the air thick and metallic, and the scent of coming rain clung to the breeze. Gray didn't move, didn't bark. His eyes scanned the tree line with a focus that made her stomach knot. She placed a hand on his head. "What is it, boy?" But he didn't answer. He simply sat, unmoving, until eventually the tension bled from his frame and he turned back inside. That day passed like fog, slow and heavy. Aline tried to distract herself with chores, cleaning out old drawers, sorting books, patching a hole in the hallway wall, but her thoughts were restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was creeping closer. Gray stayed near her the entire time, more alert than usual. He flinched at sudden noises, growled low when the wind knocked a branch against the window, and followed her like a shadow from room to room. When night fell, Aline sat on the porch, bundled in blankets. Gray curled beside her, and they both stared into the darkness. The following morning brought a brief sense of calm. The sun broke through the clouds, and golden light spilled over the porch. Aline, feeling slightly better, decided to tackle the garden. It had become a wild tangle of vines, weeds, and memories. As she worked, Gray sat at the edge of the yard, eyes on the woods. She pulled old roots from the soil, her fingers raw but her mind grateful for the distraction. For a few hours, she felt normal, alive. But the illusion shattered when she turned toward the tool shed and froze. The door was open. She hadn't been inside since returning, and she distinctly remembered locking it. Slowly, she approached, Gray at her side. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the scent of rust and damp wood. Nothing seemed out of place, but on the dusty floor she saw them, paw prints. Not from Gray. These were larger, deeper. Her breath caught in her throat. A chill climbed her spine. Gray sniffed the ground, his posture changing instantly. Hackles raised, a low growl built in his chest. Aline backed away. "Come on, Gray, let's go inside." He obeyed, but only after one last glance into the darkness. That night, sleep evaded her. She lay awake listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, each one amplified by silence. Gray paced the hallway, restless. Then, just past midnight, a loud thud echoed from the porch. She sat up, heart in her throat. Gray growled and bolted down the hallway. Aline grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and followed. She swung the door open and pointed the beam into the yard. Nothing. Just mist rolling over the grass. Then she saw it, an old wooden box placed at the foot of the steps. Her grandfather's box. She hadn't seen it in years. She knelt, hesitating, and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of items. A faded photo of her as a child holding Gray's leash, a bundle of old letters tied with twine, and a small glass jar filled with dried herbs. There was also a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was her grandfather's. "Trust him. He knows the way." Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the note to her chest, unable to breathe. How had this box appeared here? Who placed it? Why now? The next morning, she called the neighbor, Nikolai, the only person in the village who had stayed close to her grandfather. He arrived in his old pickup, face lined and curious. When she showed him the box, he went pale. "That box was buried with your grandfather," he whispered. Aline felt the world tilt. "What are you talking about?" Nikolai nodded slowly. "I remember, because I helped bury it. He said if Gray ever came back, if he found you, you'd need it." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Nikolai said, "Your grandfather was a strange man, believed in things most of us don't. He used to say Gray wasn't just a dog, he was a promise." Over the following days, the air around the house grew heavier. The whispers in the woods became more frequent. At night, Gray sat near the door, staring into the dark, unmoving. Aline began to feel watched again. Once, she caught a figure standing near the edge of the trees, only to blink and see nothing. Another time, she found deep claw marks on the porch railing. Gray growled for hours that night, refusing to rest. The tension reached a breaking point when, one evening, as she walked into the kitchen to make tea, her vision suddenly swam. The room tilted, her legs went numb. She grabbed the counter for support, but her grip slipped. The last thing she saw before collapsing was Gray lunging toward her, barking wildly. Then everything went black. She awoke moments later, or maybe hours, with a searing pain in her head and the taste of blood in her mouth. Gray was nudging her, licking her face, whining. She tried to speak, but her voice was slurred. Her hands wouldn't move. Something was terribly wrong. Gray darted to the door, barked once, then again, louder, frantic. Aline heard him scratch at the wood, pawing like mad. Then he was gone. The sound of him crashing through the brush echoed faintly behind her fading consciousness. Darkness took her again. Gray ran. He ran like he had when he was younger, before the years wore on his joints and slowed his stride. The scent of pine and earth filled his nose, but he focused on one thing only: help. He remembered the path to Nikolai's house, the old man who once gave him treats behind Aline's back, the man who smelled of oil and hay and something familiar. The lights of the village came into view, blurry in the distance. Gray didn't stop. He leapt fences, dodged roots, tore through the mud until he reached the porch. He howled. Nikolai opened the door, eyes widening. "Gray, what the—" The dog bolted back toward the woods, pausing only to make sure the man followed. And Nikolai did. When they reached the house, Aline was still lying on the kitchen floor, barely breathing. Nikolai called an ambulance with shaking hands, kneeling beside her, his voice trembling. Gray stood watch over them both, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Aline's face. Sirens came in the distance. Relief followed, but it didn't loosen Gray's muscles. He remained there, alert, until the paramedics arrived and took her away. He didn't try to climb into the ambulance. He didn't whimper or resist. He simply watched her leave, knowing she was alive, knowing he had done what he was meant to do. The sound of the ambulance's engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that pressed like a weight over the empty countryside. The porch light flickered faintly in the wind as Gray sat unmoving at the edge of the wooden steps, his dark eyes still fixed on the direction the vehicle had vanished into. He didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He simply waited. Nikolai stood beside him, his old hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow, trying to steady his breathing after the frantic rush. His mind replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over again. Aline's pale face, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the blood on the tiles. If the dog hadn't come for him when he did. He didn't finish the thought. He looked down at Gray, and something in the dog's stillness unsettled him. There was an awareness in those eyes, too calm, too knowing. Nikolai ran a hand through his thinning hair and muttered, "You're not just a dog, are you?" Gray blinked slowly in response but remained silent. As the night deepened, Nikolai made a place for Gray to rest near his barn. He brought out an old blanket and a bowl of water, but the dog barely touched either. Instead, he remained on alert, his body tense as if waiting for a command. Nikolai watched him from the window, uneasy but fascinated. Every so often, Gray would lift his head and stare at the road again, ears twitching. It was clear he wouldn't sleep. At the hospital, Aline was rushed into emergency care. The doctors worked quickly, assessing the severity of her head injury and stabilizing her blood pressure. The scans revealed a minor hemorrhage and a dangerous drop in oxygen during her initial collapse. She was lucky. Minutes more without help, and she might not have woken at all. The staff moved efficiently, inserting IV lines, monitoring brain activity, whispering to each other in calm, clinical tones. But despite all the noise around her, Aline's world remained quiet. She floated in darkness, her thoughts fragmented, sensations distant. Time passed in strange waves. Sometimes she thought she heard voices, her grandfather's laughter, the rustle of Gray's paws, the sound of her mother singing when she was little. But she couldn't reach any of it. It was like being submerged under the layers of water, everything muffled and slow. Days passed. Gray remained outside Nikolai's house during the day and lay beneath his window at night. He refused to eat unless Nikolai brought out one of Aline's old sweatshirts and left it beside the food. Then, and only then, would the dog take a few slow bites before returning to his place by the road. His eyes remained locked on the horizon, as though he knew exactly where she was and wouldn't let himself rest until she came back. Nikolai visited the hospital every day. He wasn't family, but the nurses knew who he was and let him sit by Aline's bedside. He never said much, just sat quietly, his hat in his lap, the scent of tobacco clinging to his coat. On the third day, her fingers twitched. a small, involuntary motion, but it sent a jolt through the nurse monitoring the room. By the time the doctor arrived, her eyelids were fluttering. Aline opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the white overhead lights. Everything felt wrong. Too clean, too sterile. She turned her head with effort and saw a blurred figure beside her. It took a moment, but she recognized the face. "Nikolai," she croaked, her voice cracked and dry. Relief broke across the old man's features like sunlight through clouds. "You gave us all a scare, girl," he said, gently patting her hand, "but you're going to be just fine now." She struggled to speak, but he stopped her. "Don't rush. The doctor said you need to rest." Her eyes closed again briefly, but when they reopened, there was urgency in them. "Gray?" she rasped. Nikolai smiled softly. "He's waiting. Hasn't left the road since the ambulance took you. Been howling at night like his heart's breaking." Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to see him, to touch him, to feel the weight of his head in her lap again. But her body refused to cooperate. Over the next few days, she slowly regained her strength. The doctors were cautious but optimistic. Her speech returned, her coordination improved, and the headaches became bearable. Every time she opened her eyes, she hoped to see Gray's face, but he never came inside. On the 7th day, she convinced the nurse to wheel her outside. It took some effort, bureaucracy, health risks, and liability forms, but eventually they relented. Nikolai brought his truck, and Gray was waiting in the back, sitting upright, alert. When the wheelchair was rolled into view, something in him shifted. He stood immediately, ears high, tail still. As soon as the nurse let go of the handles, Gray trotted forward, slow but purposeful. Aline reached out a trembling hand, tears streaming silently. Gray pressed his head gently against her chest, and she let out a soft sob, burying her face into his fur. No one spoke. Even the nurse wiped her eye. It was a reunion that needed no words. They stayed there for a long time. Gray lay beside the wheelchair, refusing to move. Aline stroked his fur with weak fingers and whispered promises of going home, of making everything right again. She could feel his warmth seep into her bones, thawing something that had long been frozen. Back at Nikolai's house that night, Gray slept deeply for the first time in a week. Aline remained in the hospital for 2 more days. When she was finally discharged, Nikolai drove her home. The road back to the house felt shorter, quieter. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sky was painted in soft hues of orange and rose. As they pulled into the familiar driveway, Aline stared at the porch. It felt like a lifetime since she last saw it. Gray jumped down from the back of the truck and waited for her, standing at the base of the steps like a sentry. Aline leaned on Nikolai's arm as she walked up the path. Each step hurt, but she didn't stop. Inside, the house was exactly as she had left it. The blanket still lay crumpled by the fireplace. The coffee cup sat abandoned on the table, and in that silence she felt something settle inside her. That evening, she lit the fire and sat with Gray curled at her side. Nikolai brewed tea and stayed a while, telling old stories and laughing in that warm, gravelly voice she remembered from childhood. Before he left, he placed something on the table. It was the old box they'd found, the one that had mysteriously appeared on the porch. "You hold on to this," he said. "Your grandfather wanted you to have it, and maybe now's the time to start listening." After he left, Aline opened the box again. The photo of her and Gray as a child, the herbs, the folded letters. She picked one at random and opened it. Gray is not just a protector, he's a bridge. between what was and what still can be. He found me in my darkest hour, and I know he'll do the same for you." Aline looked at Gray. He was watching her, his gaze steady. She reached out and touched his muzzle. "I think I understand now," she whispered. Outside, the wind howled gently through the trees, but inside the house there was warmth again, and the sense that something important had just begun. The wind that morning carried a bitter edge as it whistled through the tall grass outside the house. Aline sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, a steaming cup of tea cupped in her hands. Her head still ached faintly, and her movements were slow but steadier than they had been days before. Gray lay on the rug nearby, eyes half closed, ears twitching now and then as if tuned to sounds she could not hear. The house was quiet except for the soft creak of old wood and the occasional crackle of the fireplace. It was strange, she thought, how easily silence could become comfort once you stopped fearing it. And yet, beneath that comfort, something darker stirred. A nagging sensation she couldn't name had been growing each day since she returned. Like the peace that had settled over the house was too fragile to last. She tried to dismiss it, focused instead on rebuilding small pieces of her life. She took short walks around the property with Gray by her side, his steps matching hers, slowing when she slowed, stopping when she paused. She opened her grandfather's journal again, rereading his notes about Gray and the cryptic lines he had written near the end. She even ventured up to the attic one evening and found an old tape recorder wrapped in a towel. The label on the first cassette read, "March 14th, Gray." Curiosity stirred something deep in her chest. She brought it downstairs, loaded the tape, and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then her grandfather's voice, low and steady, filled the room. "March 14th. Snow melted early this year. Gray's restless. He's been watching the woods again. Last night I heard him growling, low and strange. When I went outside there was nothing. But I believe him. He sees what I can't." There was a pause, then a long breath. "I told him already. When I go, he has to find her. She'll need him more than I ever did, and he'll know when the time is right." Aline sat frozen, listening. The next segment was just silence. She pressed stop, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced at Gray. He hadn't moved, but was watching her now, his gaze unblinking. Her throat tightened. "You knew?" she whispered. "Even before I did?" That night, the wind returned, louder and colder. Branches clawed at the windows like fingers. Aline couldn't sleep. She moved from room to room, checking locks, drawing curtains. Gray followed her closely, alert. Just after midnight, the power cut out. The house plunged into darkness. The sudden silence was oppressive. No hum of the fridge, no click of the heater, only the sound of the wind and Gray's low growl. She lit a candle and carried it into the kitchen, her footsteps barely making a sound. Gray stood at the back door, ears stiff, eyes locked on something outside. Aline's skin prickled. Slowly, she stepped beside him and peeked through the glass. Nothing but black. Still, Gray's body remained tense, his muscles coiled. She didn't know what to do. Her phone was dead. There was no signal out here anyway. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and opened the door. Gray bolted. "Ah, Gray!" she shouted, but he was already running. Without thinking, she pulled on boots, grabbed a coat, and took off after him into the night. The cold hit her like a wall. She stumbled through the brush, flashlight beam bouncing wildly, calling his name over and over. The woods swallowed her voice. Branches whipped her face, Roots tugged at her feet. Her breath came in harsh gasps. She had no idea where he was going, only that she had to follow. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement ahead. Gray. He was standing at the edge of the old shed, his body rigid. Aline slowed, her heart pounding. The flashlight beam trembled in her hand. She moved closer, step by cautious step, until she stood beside him. The shed door was open. She hadn't touched it in weeks, and yet there it stood, yawning wide into the dark. Gray didn't move. He growled once, deep and low. Aline hesitated, then shone her light inside. At first, she saw only dust and cobwebs. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the scratches. Deep, jagged marks along the back wall, claw marks. No animal she knew of could make those. Aline's stomach twisted. She took a shaky step back. That's when she heard it. A sound from the woods. Not the wind. Something heavier. A shuffle. A crack of underbrush. Gray spun, barking once, sharply. Aline turned, the flashlight swinging around. Nothing. "Let's go," she whispered. "Now." They backed away slowly, Gray's body shielding hers. The moment they reached the edge of the field, he broke into a run. She followed as fast as her legs would carry her, adrenaline dulling the pain. Back at the house, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking. Gray paced in front of the windows, growling at shadows. Aline dropped to the floor, her back against the door, struggling to breathe. "What was that?" she whispered. "What the hell was that?" Gray didn't answer, but in his eyes she saw the same fear she felt. The next morning, she didn't sleep. She made coffee with trembling hands and sat in the living room wrapped in 3 blankets. Gray finally lay down but didn't rest. His eyes stayed open, watching. Around noon, Nikolai arrived with supplies. He took one look at her and knew something was wrong. She told him everything. The shed, the noises, the claw marks. Nikolai went pale. He sat down heavily, exhaling through his nose. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," he said, "but your grandfather, he wasn't just keeping a dog. He was guarding something old, something most people don't want to believe exists anymore." Aline stared at him. "What do you mean?" Nikolai hesitated, then said, "There are stories, passed down for generations, about things in the forest, spirits, creatures. They don't bother you unless you disturb their ground. But sometimes, someone does. And they come closer." She shook her head. "That's insane." He met her gaze. "So is a dog returning after years. So is a box that was buried with your grandfather showing up on your porch." She said nothing. That night, she didn't light the fire. She sat in silence with Gray pressed close. They both stared into the darkness beyond the windows, waiting. And somewhere, deep in the woods, something waited too. The wind roared through the trees like a warning. The sky had turned a thick, bruised gray by morning, and the air was heavy with the scent of approaching rain. Aline stood on the porch, wrapped in her grandfather's coat, staring into the distance where the woods loomed darker than usual. Gray sat beside her, unmoving ears, perked eyes locked on the same distant point. Neither of them spoke. It had been 2 nights since the shed incident. 2 nights of barely sleeping candles burning down to stubs, and Gray standing watch at the windows like a soldier on patrol. Aline hadn't told anyone else about the scratches or the movement in the trees. Not even Nikolai. She didn't want to hear his theories. She didn't want to put words to what she was starting to feel. That something old and strange was beginning to stir. She spent the day trying to distract herself. She cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganized drawers, reread the same page of her grandfather's journal 5 times without absorbing a single word. Gray followed her everywhere like a second shadow. The tension between them and the house grew thicker with each hour. Outside, the wind picked up snapping tree limbs and scattering leaves across the fields. By late afternoon, the storm finally broke. Rain slammed against the windows in sheets, and thunder rolled across the sky like a voice too deep to understand. The power went out again. Aline didn't move. She just lit the oil lamp by the fireplace and sat in its flickering glow, Gray pressed tight to her side. When the thunder cracked directly overhead, she flinched, but Gray didn't even blink. He was focused. Too focused. Something was coming. That night, as the storm raged around the house, Aline dreamed of fire. In the dream, the woods were burning orange and red tongues of flame licking at the sky, and in the center of it all stood Gray, his eyes glowing like embers. Behind him she saw a figure, tall and indistinct, wrapped in smoke. It raised an arm, pointing toward her. She woke, gasping heart, hammering the smell of smoke still clinging to her nose, even though there was no fire. Gray was awake, staring at the window. Aline followed his gaze. Lightning flashed, and for a single second she saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the forest. Then darkness again. She didn't breathe, didn't move. Gray began to growl a sound so deep it vibrated through the floorboards. Aline stood slowly, legs shaking, and walked to the door. Gray moved with her, his body tense, his teeth bared. She opened the door and stepped out into the storm. Rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her face. She squinted into the trees. Nothing. Just wind and shadows. She turned to go back inside. Then she heard it. A voice. Not loud, but clear. A man's voice, whispering her name. She spun around, eyes wide. There was no one. She backed into the house, slammed the door, and locked it. Her breath came fast and shallow. "I heard it, Gray," she whispered. "I swear I heard it." Gray growled again, low and warning. The rest of the night passed in silence, broken only by the storm. In the morning, the rain had stopped, but the world felt wrong. The air was too still, the birds absent, the sky too bright. Aline walked through the house, checking every lock, every window. Nothing had been disturbed, but she didn't feel safe. She poured coffee with shaking hands and sat by the fire, but her thoughts were elsewhere. On the shed, on the voice, on the dream. By noon, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and her coat and walked toward the shed. Gray followed reluctantly. As they neared the structure, his growls returned soft but constant. The door was still open. She stepped inside, heart pounding. The claw marks were still there, but now there was something else. A symbol scratched into the floor. A circle with lines radiating from it like a sun or an eye. She didn't recognize it. She didn't want to. She stepped back out, breathing hard. Gray barked once, sharp and urgent. She turned and saw him facing the woods again, his entire body rigid. She followed his line of sight and saw the figure again. Not a dream this time. A man, tall, wearing something long and dark, standing unnaturally still, too far to make out his face. She froze, then blinked. He was gone. She ran. Back in the house, she locked the door, sat on the floor, and cried. Gray curled around her, shielding her body with his. That evening, Nikolai arrived. She didn't let him in at first, just shouted through the door. "There's someone out there," she said, "in the woods." When she finally opened the door, he looked at her long and slow, then stepped inside. She told him everything. The dream, the voice, the figure, the symbol. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "I think you need to leave." "I can't. You don't understand what this is." "I think I do." Nikolai looked at Gray. He's not just a dog. You know that now, don't you? Aline nodded. He's a guardian. Your grandfather knew. So did I. He's the reason nothing worse has happened. Aline felt cold. What is it then? Out there? Nikolai sighed. I don't know. Some say it's an old spirit, a keeper of broken things. Some say it's a curse tied to the land. But it doesn't like change. It doesn't like people coming back. Aline looked at Gray. He stood perfectly still, watching her, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. She turned to Nikolai. I'm not leaving. I don't care what it is. This is my home. Nikolai didn't argue. He only nodded. Then you need to be ready. That night, Aline prepared the house like a fortress. She lit every candle, placed salt at every window, burned sage in every corner. She read from her grandfather's journal aloud, repeating his final passage like a prayer. Gray is a bridge between what was and what must be. The air grew colder. Gray stood at the door, waiting, and the dark pressed closer than ever before. The final night arrived without ceremony, without warning. The sun set early behind a thick curtain of low gray clouds, casting the forest and fields into a premature dusk. The wind had stilled, and the air outside felt too heavy too, still like the world was holding its breath. Inside the house, Aline moved slowly, methodically checking the locks, testing the flashlight batteries, stoking the fire, until the flames licked high against the blackened bricks. Gray followed her every step, silent and alert, his ears flicking his body tight with tension. She could feel it too. The pressure building like a storm just beneath the surface of the world. Something was coming. She lit every candle in the house just like the night before. She pulled out her grandfather's old journal once again and read the words aloud, not because she expected magic, not because she thought it would stop anything, but because it made her feel close to him and because the words carried weight now in ways they never had before. Gray is a bridge between what was and what must be. She traced the ink with her finger and whispered the final line. He will not fail you. At 10 o'clock, the first sound came, a soft, rhythmic tapping at the window like fingers against glass. Aline froze her breath, catching. Gray stood instantly, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the dark pane. The tapping continued. She grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and approached the window. The beam pierced the dark but revealed nothing. No face, no form, no movement. She waited, heart thudding in her chest. Then it stopped. She turned away, only for the sound to begin again, this time at the back of the house. Gray growled low and dangerous. Aline moved toward the kitchen, keeping close to the wall. The sound wasn't fingers, this time it was something heavier, a dragging noise like nails on wood. She peered through the window again, and this time she saw them. Footprints in the frost just outside, deep and wide, far too large to be human. She stepped back. Gray barked once, a deep warning that echoed through the house. Then came the knock. Not a tap, not a scrape, but a knock on the front door, 3 times, slow, deliberate. She stared at the door, frozen, unable to move. Her mind raced, screaming not to open it, but her legs carried her forward anyway. Gray stood in front of the door, his body blocking hers. He turned his head slightly, as if to say, not yet. Then the door handle turned. Not violently, calmly, slowly, as if whoever or whatever stood on the other side knew it would be let in. Aline backed away, tears filling her eyes. "What do you want?" she whispered. Another knock. Gray barked again, louder and more forceful than before, and the sound that came next chilled her to the bone. It was laughter, soft and deep, and unmistakably human. She dropped to her knees, her fingers gripping the collar of Gray's fur. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me." Then silence. For a long moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Even the fire had quieted, its crackle gone still. Then, from outside, a voice. "You cannot keep what belongs to the forest." Gray moved, not away from her, but forward toward the door. She stood with him, placing a hand on his back. "You're not going alone," she said, though her voice trembled. He looked back at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, something ancient, something far beyond any dog she'd ever known. Together they opened the door. The wind hit them immediately, though the trees stood still. And there, standing just beyond the porch, was the figure tall-robed in shadow, faceless. But its presence was overwhelming, pressing against her skin like pressure beneath water. Gray stepped forward between her and the thing, his body braced his head low. The creature didn't move. It simply stood watching. Aline reached into her pocket and pulled out the pendant her grandfather had left hidden in the journal, a circle carved with symbols she didn't understand. She held it in the air between them. "You can't have him," she said, her voice rising, "and you can't have me." The creature tilted its head slightly. Then Gray lunged. Not with violence, but with purpose. He ran straight into the figure, and the world shifted. The porch, the trees, the night sky all twisted like smoke, being drawn into a vortex, and for a moment Aline thought she was falling. Then it was gone. She collapsed to her knees. The forest was empty. The creature had vanished. And so had Gray. She screamed his name over and over into the night until her voice gave out. Nothing answered. She crawled back inside and wept on the floor, shaken and broken. The candles burned low. The fire flickered. But she was alone. The days that followed passed like fog. Nikolai came and found her collapsed on the porch, barely able to speak. He brought food water, sat beside her without questions. When she could finally talk, she told him everything. He didn't argue, didn't call her crazy. He only said one thing. He did what he was meant to do. Weeks passed. The forest grew quiet again. No more voices, no more knocks. The shed remained untouched, the symbols gone. Aline slowly began to move again. She cooked. She walked the garden. She cleaned the attic. She grieved. But every night she sat on the porch with a second blanket folded beside her, just in case. One morning, near the end of winter, she woke before dawn to the sound of soft paw steps on wood. She ran to the porch, barefoot, heart pounding, and there he was, Gray, thin-scarred, limping, but alive. He stepped toward her, and she fell to the floor, wrapping her arms around him, sobbing. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew you'd come back." He rested his head in her lap and closed his eyes. That spring, the forest bloomed brighter than ever. Birds returned, the air warmed, and the house, once filled with silence, now echoed with laughter. Gray remained by her side always. A little slower, a little stiffer, but unchanged in soul. Aline never spoke again of the shadow or the voice, but sometimes at night she would glance towards the trees and nod quietly, as if to acknowledge something watching from beyond. The past had come for her, but love, loyalty, and the spirit of something greater had stood between her and the dark. Gray had returned, and with him had come peace. Sometimes true loyalty doesn't come from people, but from those who stay silent and feel everything. If this story touched you, leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel.